good to start?
Yeah.
Cool. 3, 2, 1. I want to make one thing very clear at the start of this speech, which is Affirmative is essentially defending the status quo. Politicians mislead, they gaslight other people, they misinform people, and they lie every single day because it's in their incentive to win. And I challenge this team to name a political party that isn't dishonest, to name a political party that hasn't engaged in the tactics that we're going to be outlining. Obviously, we'd be happy to increase the extent to which this occurs. This is what we're going to stand behind in this debate. So, 4 things in this speech. The first thing I'll do is explain why there is such a high imperative to preventing the Republicans from winning the next election, and why, therefore, this will justify any of the possible measures that we would take. The second thing I'll do is explain exactly the types of, lies we would basically do and the tactics we would use. The third thing I'll explain is why it's likely to be particularly effective. And the fourth thing I'll do is explain what these guys have to support. So, why is there such a high imperative to stop the Republican Party from winning? The first thing to establish is the Republican Party has a proven track record of gutting democratic institutions, right? Like Trump, in his presidential candidacy, appointed more judges to the Supreme Court than any other president in recorded history. They do things like appoint partisan officials to very high branches of government to specifically create institutions that favour the Republican Party, to disenfranchise Democrats and other political parties for years to come. They do things like remove just checks and balances on democracy to the point where democracy can't function. A great example of this is just like completely gutting the Environmental Protection Agency to the point where they couldn't institute any forms of policies. And not only were they not passing needed environmental policies, but because these were just stacked with Republican sympathisers that had already been lobbied by big businesses and had Republican interests, they repealed a lot of current environmental agency policies that then led to just not only a huge degree in increases of habitat destruction, but just unprecedented amounts of pollution in the US. The second thing we want to characterize is just the Republican stance on international relations is often absolutely terrible. See the way that Trump got into a series of tax wars with Europe that's heavily shrunk the American economy and the trade balance. See the way that they've just been saying that they don't need to send support to Ukraine, for example, and they're perfectly happy to stand behind tons of Ukrainians dying. See the fact that Trump pulled out of NATO and that Trump pulled out of the Paris Agreement. So, at this point in the debate, you should believe that there is an incredibly high imperative to stop the Republican Party coming into power. And I would note that if you believe it's a particularly high imperative, it also suggests that the means that we have to try and stop the Republican Party are, we have a lot of leniency, right? We have a lot of license to do this for the reason that pretending to be a good guy and playing by the rules when you know you'll lose is the same as just letting the bad thing happen. Sometimes you've got to get your hands dirty to prevent a genocide, right? So, that establishes why the imperative is so high. The next thing I'm going to do in this speech is characterize the ways that we would do this. The first thing I want to just elaborate on is we would mimic the ways that Democratic super PACs have already been behaving in the past. For example, in I think it was 2022, they funded MAGA candidates in the Republican primaries in order to ensure that when they come up against more centrist Democrats, they would lose. So we obviously engage in things like that. The second thing we would do is just create conspiracy theories about Republicans, which is pretty fucking funny, which should probably be a benefit. Things like the current narratives that exist, the Republican elites are secretly trying to prevent Trump from running so they can just run Ron DeSantis, they're completely corrupt, they're all wackos. We definitely run those conspiracy narratives. The third thing we do is just accuse various Republicans of things that they could plausibly do, but that individual candidates haven't necessarily aligned themselves with. So for example, we just, accuse people of the general Republican caricatures of they want to stop all black people from voting, they want to remove voting rights, they hate every single woman, they're not going to give anyone an abortion. And we'd probably accuse people who even are more moderate Republicans of being in support or standing behind the more extreme Republicans to kind of lump them together as a big sum of crazy people. The fourth thing we do is, from the Democrats' perspective, we would change or hide our policy in order to suit the current political environment. So, if inflation was getting particularly high, and that was a priority of a lot of voters, we would say, Joe Biden doesn't care about the economy, he cares about getting you guys the next paycheck, right? Similarly, we would do things like say, Joe Biden's always supported gay people, right? He didn't, used to be anti-gay or whatever, right? We would just create political narratives that are most convenient for us winning at a particular time. And the final thing we would do is we would be quite disingenuous with the ways that we would make criticisms. So for example, we would say, well, Trump blew the budget and spent more than any other president in recorded history, even though that was the fault of COVID and not the fault of Donald Trump. We would just create those correlation errors in order to make the Republicans look stupid. So, why is this likely to be particularly effective? 4 reasons. 1, the fact that this has already been done by a large amount of super PACs suggests that it's actually quite effective, an effective way to manipulate voters, because otherwise why would they be spending a huge amount of money on this stuff? The second reason it's likely to be effective is that it plays on people's existing fears within politics. It's pretty easy to sweep people up on these narratives. They're pretty easy to understand because they're not about highly technical aspects of politics. They're just about believing a narrative and believing a story that people are probably already prone to believe based on those fears that I've explained. The third thing is just like most extreme Republicans have a history of losing in presidential races to more, I guess, sort of like reasonable Democrats, which just means that the earlier mechanisms that I described about funding things like MAGA candidates in the Republican primaries are likely to be particularly successful. And the fourth reason this is likely to work is that a large majority of voters in the US are not politically engaged. And what that suggests is that on their side, right, they have a whole bunch of sensationalist narratives, but they're only coming from conservative right-wing perspectives. On our side, we would drown those out by creating a series of democratic, I guess, lies and narratives that then either cancel out or work in our favor, right? So, what I would outline is that the negative team has to stand behind handicapping themselves, because if you believe that this is effective, you have to believe that they operate in a world where Democrats are giving themselves every less opportunity to win. They're not taking the advances they have, and they are likely to exist in a world where they're probably, they don't have as good a chance to win the next election. So, the last part of this speech will just explain what these guys need to stand behind and why it's worse. Obviously, I've already alluded to the fact that they have to stand behind less effective ways of beating Trump, but there are some other important things to note. And that's mainly that they would have to prevent all of what super PACs are currently doing, like all the misinformation and lies and spreading that super PACs are currently spreading, propagating, which just means that they would have to have ridiculous top-down bureaucratic control of every single election narrative, particularly because super PACs are independent, which means that the only way to actually police and monitor what they're saying and have them not engage in these practices is to basically co-opt them. And that just means that the Democrats lose a huge amount of funding. People aren't going to donate anymore. People aren't going to think they're effective. That's a huge harm for the Democrats. But it also just means that you hamper any Republicans' ability to win. And that just means that, as I explained, things like the Lincoln Project never ever get published or engaged in. You lose huge amounts of donor money, and you just waste a whole bunch of money actually enforcing all these specific regulations and holding people to account, which just detracts from the party's ability to do a variety of other things, which, yes, will probably also, to some extent looks like creating and propagating these lies, but also in their world probably just also means not engaging in developing as much policy. So, for those reasons, you should believe a few things at the end of this speech. 1, Republicans winning would be absolutely terrible for the world and for the American people. 2, therefore we are justified in instituting a series of tactics that are likely to be effective. 3, these guys have to stand behind the likely comparative, or at least plausible enough comparative that it would be a detrimental harm, that the Republicans win and they're going to do less about it. Vote affirmative.
The state that has a monopoly on violence, that imprisons you, that can sometimes sentence you to death, ought always be legitimate. That legitimacy is taken away when you remove someone's access to honesty. There's a huge principle which the affirmative team will never overcome in this debate, but even if they try, they will always fail on all levels because they never actually benefit the Democrats with these laws. In fact, I will prove, even if they push this burden, which is unreasonable, that this actually always harms the Democrats. But before that, the principle. There's 2 things to say here, which is that everyone here would be morally opposed to dictators using armed forces in order to persuade the decision-making of any populace. This is identical, or at least morally force someone to vote against their interests. This is significant for 5 reasons, and we'll just preempt stuff to what they might say, which is the stuff that Republicans do this already. Firstly, quite childishly, two wrongs just don't make a right. But you aren't actually undoing any wrong under their side for a couple of reasons. One, it's contingent that you balance out this necessarily, that you somehow balance out the Republican misinformation that they concede is already very, very good under their side, which you don't do. Secondly, new people are actually being deceived. You are not deceiving the same Republicans who are being deceived by the Republican super PAC misinformation. You are actually being deceived. You are deceiving a whole new populace of people. And the last thing to say here is just that Republicans likely amp up their response, or if we do so anyway, which means you are just increasing the amount of deception that occurs in already highly impactful legal system. The impact here is absolutely enormous, which is to say that people just fundamentally lose their right. And not only are they losing their right, they are losing right on an illegitimate basis. You are infringing on a person's moral value at the point that that person is existing in a society that imposes laws on them that might kill them if they do wrong under those laws, if that state is not ever elected in an honest way. This government will always have a huge effect on people's lives, or always terrible. The other thing to say is this leader represents all people, and is now illegitimate for that reason. This leader doesn't represent any of the people. People who live under this leader are significantly morally harmed. So, after that, why is this type of deception always going to be exposed and called out? First, there are three reasons here. Firstly, all media has an incentive to call out this type of misinformation. Three things here. Firstly, right-wing media has incentives, obviously, because it is especially favourable for your election chances if you call out the lies of the opposite side. Secondly, there are centrist incentives of media, which is just one to say, PolitiFact would probably really love to be seen as that, really even balance here, and they, centrists jump at every chance to call out both sides for some wrongdoing. And the third thing to say here is that left-wing media really despises super PACs misinformation, which is to say that there is probably an internal unity issue inside the Democrats, which is that parts of the Democrats are quite ideologically driven, which means they are probably opposed to any action that the super PACs do, especially bad. But the second reason for why this always gets exposed is because voters just recognize it. Democrats are extensively exposed to the type of manipulation that occurs from the right, and especially effective at calling this out. The second thing to say why voters recognize it is just because they are lies. Democrats are quite educated, generally speaking, and are very capable of actually recognizing this, especially when the media does a helping job of doing that. The third thing to say on why this is always exposed is because there are just campaign laws in the states, which is that there are three incentives here, which is auditors are very, very aggressive of this type of misinformation because they necessarily need to in order to keep their jobs. The second thing to say is that Republicans probably lean on these auditors and lean on any mechanisms that they might have to expose this kind of misinformation. And the third thing to say is that law firms have an incentive to raise this kind of misinformation because they want to make a profit over legislating against it. All this to say that this always gets exposed, which is then has the huge impact of all of the backlash, which is three things. So, firstly, voters just will dislike this. One, I already tell you, Democrats aren't stupid, and this will likely feel like a huge betrayal. Why? Because they always despise the fact that the main way the Republicans get around things is by fucking with democracy, and at the point I proved to you that this messes with democracy, you are doing a similar betrayal to these democratic people, which is to say that in the world in which you absolutely despise gerrymandering, at the point at which the Democrats make an active claim to winning elections on opposing the lack of giving out water bottles in Georgia, this is a massive betrayal at the point you start to fuck with democracy. This is super impactful because this really fucks with your base of your most important voter base. The second thing to say on backlash is this just also seems super hypocritical, which just reduces your capacity to call out Republicans in the future. And the last thing to say on backlash is this probably swings centrists, or swing voters, because notably they are in the States are quite apathetic. You just lose the potential to engage them ever if there are lies coming at you from either side. And the last thing to say on backlash is this is probably going to be the moral panic that is likely to mobilize Republican voters. I'm going to talk a bit later about how this is super important for Republicans, but it probably activates all the anxiety of the January 6th stuff, or the disproportionate leadership of the super PACs, which is to say that this is probably the type of Oh my god, it's the Jewish elites who are controlling everything. This is the type of the moral panic that occurs when you have far more misinformation, especially when it starts to mess with a democracy. It's probably the moral backlash that enables Republicans to actually get some votes. So why then, even after that, we win, they never overcome that burden. But importantly here, why is this super unconvincing? Why does this actually harm the Democrats? There are 4 reasons why this is unconvincing. Firstly, the Democrats just probably lack as much experience as the Republicans do, which means at the point at which they are doing equal amounts, the Republicans are probably just far better practiced, being that this is the way in which they have gained voters for years before. The second thing to say is Democrats are probably smarter, and they probably lack the idiots in order to amplify these messages. Notably, these messages get the most amount of traction on social media, where they are perpetuated by people who are stupid and buy them. Thirdly, super PACs represent a minority of Democratic, which probably says that they probably don't resonate with all levels of Democrats. And the last thing to say, they're probably just unbelievably unbelievable, which is to say that they are just lies. Cool. Why is this takeaway discourse? And the last thing to say, actually, sorry, should have done this integrated, but what do we hear from them about why it will be convincing or effective in any way? Which is, one, they say they've done it before, uncomparative with the Republicans. Second, they say it pans to fear, notably the populist narrative is uniquely mobilized by the Republican Party. Thirdly, they say extreme Republicans lose to reasonability from Democrats all the time, which is an argument that fundamentally works against them. When you're more reasonable, when you don't engage in manipulation, that is the type of way that you've won elections before. Importantly, why this doesn't benefit Democrats? Because the Democrats are going to win this election anyway. Because the polarization in the state is already fucking massive. The second thing to say here is that Trump and DeSantis are just so shit at motivating people to vote for them, mostly because they rely on populist narratives that just make people not want to vote for anyone. If you are so disinterested and you run on a platform that just says the government is all bad, they are dirty, we should get rid of them, that doesn't mobilize anyone to vote. It just motivates people not to vote for the Democrats. That's what they're good at. They're not good at motivating people to vote. The last thing to say here is that it takes away discourse that Biden is actually good at things. Truth actually wins election, especially for the Democrats.
For a team so willing to lose this debate on their principles, it would have been really nice for them to spend more than 15 seconds proving why, come 2024, someone who is going to gut democratic institutions, somebody who is going to condemn the United States to further decades of crumbling infrastructure, of lack of credible action on climate change, or condemn millions of people to die in Ukraine after withdrawing their support, was not going to win that election, in spite of everything that had already happened, in spite of coming within a couple million votes of winning the popular vote in the last election, after a catastrophic attack on democracy all throughout his presidency. Donald Trump was poised to make a credible challenge for the 2024 election. Beyond that, House Republicans and Senate Republicans were even better positioned to make credible threats to the fate of American democracy. We were the team that came packing, and they didn't give us anything. Let's firstly talk about this principle. I will explain then why these tactics will work, and lastly, I'll touch again on the imperative. Let's address this principle. A few responses. The first thing to say, the amount of new people who are exposed to deception or are exposed to the silver bullet of misinformation is actually unclear. We tell you that people under the status quo are already exposed to enormous amounts of both Republican and Democrat, super PAC-backed misinformation, that this is the state of play of US politics at the moment, because we explained that super PACs are independent, they're backed by people whose political interests are often aligned with, for instance, their business interests or any of their other interests, that fund those political action groups that then take action on their behalf. Everybody wants to win, everybody wants their candidate to win because they want favorable regulatory environments, because they want particular political outcomes. And that means that note that constitutionally in the United States, those kind of political donations and those kind of political actions are protected as free speech, as a revealed preference from throughout the history of the interpretation of that particular constitutional amendment there. So the amount of this super PAC action that people are actually exposed to in a day-to-day sense from both sides of the political spectrum, we explain at Ben, and I believe Udai is really particularly gleeful to talk to you more about a third affirmative as well, is enormous. So that is actually not a very big change there. The second thing to say here is use a different fucking stock argument, guys. This is not the state engaging in it. We explain that super PACs are independent. The state power principle does not hold up in this debate because it is not the action of the state that is taking place here. Honestly, a lot of the time it's not even the actions of particular Democrats themselves. It's not even the actions of elected officials that wield coercive power over individuals. And to the extent that this is trickery, we explain that that is fairly symmetric to the status quo, we would simply not hamstring ourselves and doom ourselves to a lost election, doom ourselves to 4 more years, Donald Trump, doom ourselves to a presidency for somebody who caused like a literal insurrection the last time he lost an election there. Let's secondly explain why these tactics will work. We explained that these kinds of tactics are required in order to remain competitive in any number of these many races that occur across the country during an election year. We explained that one, they have worked, and opposing them would require side negative to stand behind a less successful series of takes and strategies that work for Democrats across the country because they are an actual product of everybody's desire to win. We secondly explained that these tactics are used by Republicans constantly, so you naturally make yourself far less and there's no indication that they will stop using them. In fact, there is only more indication that they will continue to ramp them up. So you need to make yourself less competitive compared to your direct opposition there. We explained that lastly, that no, they do not get exposed in the same way. One, because a 24/7 media cycle means that any single one of these instances is a drop in a bucket. We also explained at Ben why these things are really difficult to call out. Like the kind of claims that we make here are often protected under freedom of speech laws because they are like donations to a particular like crazy political candidate that will inevitably get beaten out by a more moderate Democrat, any of those kind of things. Or we explained that any one instance of it being called out is a drop in a bucket in a very swift media cycle. We secondly explained that there are equal incentives on both sides to call each other out all the time. So at best, this is dismissed as political mudslinging from parties against one another. Like every time a Democrat, for instance, tries to call out Republicans, a lot of the time they are accused of by even people in the center or even moderates of just engaging in political mudslinging rather than actually trying to meaningfully access the truth. Seen as an inherently political exercise, will similarly be seen as such when Republicans do it to Democrats if they even can. But also, we would tell you that people have a direct incentive to not call this kind of stuff out because the more that they introduce it, the more airtime they give it, the more likely it is that their own behavior gets similarly called out. Like again, this debate and the debate between these two political parties will turn into the Spider-Man meme, and they will just point at each other doing identical things, and that draws more attention to everybody here. We also would just say, empirically, AOC has about 200 different lies that or mistruths she said throughout her political career, exposed for all to see on PolitiFact. You can go look it up during deliberation. Anyone in this room give a fuck? I know I don't. Doesn't matter. Moving on. We'll explain 3 things. What these things are. Secondly, why people will believe it. And third, why does the people will then act on their belief in those things? What will these things be? First thing to explain is we would have or I will explain uniquely. We would happily also lobby for things like gerrymandering to districts. We'd happily lobby governors, especially in purple states where successful gubernatorial elections have been contested by Democrats, to do things like sneaky shit, to distribute polling centers away, to suppress turnout from the kind of political groups that often are non-college educated white voters that typically vote for Republicans. We'd happily employ all those same tactics there. Secondly, we would actively stand behind making shit up. But lastly, we often don't even need to make shit up that's very persuasive, because we can do things like aggrandize any of these scandals or missteps or anything that is done by a particular political party. Eugene, I'm really excited to hear what you have to say, buddy. The second under this issue, why will people believe them? We explained that these lies are often complex and plausible and really difficult to verify, especially at first instance. So saying that a person caused a budget flow, caused a budget deficit flow that was actually the result of COVID, it's often really difficult to attribute, especially for the average person that we're talking about that hears this. We secondly explain that people compare all subsequent information to the first information that they received, which is a reason why it's extremely hard to change people's minds. So even if it does get called out later, people have already formed the view that somebody behaved in a certain way. It's very difficult to call that information out at a later time. And we would simply get there first by doing things like inventing and blowing up controversy to make sure that the super PAC's voice is the first one there. Lastly, we would explain that the techniques that people use to do this are relatively sophisticated. And no, it's not the case that Republican super PACs are inherently better at deceiving people than Democrat super PACs, because Democrats are more honest. These same groups of people employ the same algorithms on social media and the same media conglomerates and the same kind of campaigners, the same PR specialists to do deception. There are experts in deception that are employed by both political parties. It's not that one is better than the other or one is more practiced than the other because Republicans lie more. Please run any of these claims through a plausibility check, or I don't know, run it through PolitiFact. Nobody fucking cares anyway. They will use things like social media metadata. They will use things like conventional media. And also think about the kind of people that we're talking about here. The average American reads at a 7th grade level and barely engaged in politics. Oh my god. Lastly, why is it the case that people will act on them? One, we explained that for the people who will actually vote these people out, panic is often what's required to get people to the polls, because voting is not compulsory, because it's held on a work day. Any of those trade-offs, they will make that trade-off if they think that it's sufficiently important. But secondly, equally, the kinds of conspiracies that we would prop up people. That is to say, we would find the craziest motherfucker and we would funnel enormous amounts of money from the Republican Party into his primary campaign, as they have already done with Herschel Walker Jr., so that they then get beat out. So that is a very fairly rational choice that's being made by voters there. Lastly, and finally, like in this speech on the imperative, this touches the moral question of this debate because it gives us enormous moral license to do whatever it takes to get these people out. We explain that getting these guys out is what will deliver funds to Ukraine. We explain that it will mean that we do not have a dramatic escalation in conflict with China. We explain that it's what gets credible action on climate change. We explain that it's what protects democratic institutions into the future. If you care about democracy, if you care about the next 10 years, or the next 20 years, or the next 50 years of world history, vote for the side that came packing.
Three problems with the opposition's case. The first is that they decided not to read the topic. This is a support debate, so when they get up there and say, this will require us to top down take control of these super PACs and this will reduce our funding, this is insane. Is it a good or bad thing that the super PACs have done this, yeah? And we think it's an awful idea, because you spent all of this energy establishing this elaborate conspiracy theory to undermine this dude's reputation, along the way you've swayed two people's votes and done something that is truly pretty morally dubious. We think this is an awful exchange. First big problem that they have is why? Just for what end? And here's the problem. You don't need conspiracy theories because the literal Republican candidates are pedophiles and are lunatics. You don't need accusations that they are extreme. They get up there and say abortion should be illegal. They are extreme. They absolutely happily would have banned it. They possibly could have done it earlier. You don't need to go out there and fund MAGA candidates to win the primaries because Trump has handpicked them for you to win the primaries regardless. You don't need correlation errors because by their own analysis, the Republican Party has financially ruined the US through a trade war with China. Guess what? Oh, actually, I guess you do need to lie to explain that Biden is a hero. We reckon that the Republicans will fully encourage you to say that Biden is a hero of queer people because that is exactly what will foster the moral panic in Republicans to say this is exactly why we cannot have him in power again. And obviously all Democrats think this lie is stupid and no one believes it. And this is the problem with their case. Firstly, no one believes it. And the people that do believe it are literally the converted. There are a whole bunch of Democrats that would have voted for the Democrats regardless and buy into these conspiracy theories because of extensive polarization. That means that they just want to buy into whatever hurts the Republicans. We think that, yeah, maybe it's true that one or two people now feel super panicked to vote for the Democrats regardless, but along the way you manage to lose a whole bunch of Democrats that do see through these lies, where Democrats historically are significantly more likely to be college educated and far less susceptible to this misinformation. You lose their trust, you make them and sap a huge amount of their motivation and energy to volunteer for the movement, to actually stand by their principles and say, at least the Democrat Party doesn't engage in this nonsense like the Republicans do. Not to mention, you've lost a whole bunch of centrist votes as well, where you get centrist media getting up there saying, look at the balancing game now, the Republicans do it, and here's some examples of the Democrats doing it too. And this is exactly why, for what little benefit you've gotten, you've lost votes along the way. But second, even if you miraculously believe more people by panic vote for the Democrats, the Republicans just super easily dismiss this as sets of smears more broadly in society, which means it really takes the sting out of any of this type of stuff, and it activates narratives of victimhood that encourage more Republicans to vote on their side. So the panic works both ways. The third, and the biggest problem, is it's just not unique. The Democrats are good at telling the truth. And extensively, super PACs are garbage at actually using this tool for misinformation. It's because they don't have experience extensively with misinformation. The Republicans run rings around them in terms of lying through their teeth and finding the lies that people believe. But more importantly, this is the mechanism I love, there's just no amplification. The problem is, the Republicans have a large number of genuinely very stupid people that are anti-vax and happily get up there and retweet these obvious conspiracy theories. They amplify it like nobody's business. The problem is the Democrats don't have that. So your super PACs spending a bunch of money trying to establish these elaborate conspiracy theories that they structurally do not have an actual base to continue to amplify and get that free coverage going forward into the future. That is why the Democrats just say the truth, because they have a million examples where the Republicans do the exact same things that you would want to construct
Democrats are lied for, they just tell those things, the Democrats amplify that instead. So it's way more efficient under our side, but you don't have the risks of people being like, no, this is a lie. You don't have all the problems of it activating narratives of victimhood of Republicans. You don't have the problem that it's just counterproductive and embarrassing when people do call it out, which might only happen in rare instances, but you just need that one single campaign electoral campaign law that you violated for the Republicans to extensively weaponize that one instance to explain why all their misinformation is totally legitimate. But last, this, in their best world, literally kind of gets up there and says, it's like the Spider-Man meme. That is precisely the problem. Who do you think the Spider-Man meme benefits? It benefits the Republicans. And that is because Democrats uniquely win on messages of rational policy. There is no question of which will actually provide better outcomes to people on the ground. But the more you sow confusion, the more you cloud discourse, the more you genuinely polarize society and build those sets of moral panics, that only benefits Republicans, who historically have struggled to get turnout high. And that is why they lean into such pro-abortion narratives that lose the general popular support but energize their base. I don't understand why you continue to do this. But even if they managed to get maybe 10 more people voting under their side, just could not care less. Because the problem is, this is such a small, selective utilization of a couple lies in society, and I think the principle of this just being morally wrong suggests it's bad and it shouldn't be supported. Like Connor's own analysis of this is a drop in the bucket of the 24-hour news cycle really suggests it isn't that important in swaying votes and isn't doing a great deal. We should go with our morals and our principles here. Why? They give three broad responses. The first is that people mislead, they misinform, they do all this stuff all the time anyways. That does not make it right. To the extent that we want to be able to call out politicians and say, there's something wrong when you actively misinformed that person, you only are allowed to have that moral response to say that was immorally wrong when you stand by and say that even these small forms are unacceptable as well. Because the way they try and get around this, secondly, is by explaining, oh, they're only these kind of small things, and they're pretty comical, right? Like, we're just setting up a conspiracy theory here. But the problem here is that concealing things is still wrong. In the same way that if we held a gun to someone's head and told them you must vote for this party that is obviously wrong, just because you've cleverly tricked that person with your conspiracy theory, that is the exact same manipulation that ultimately has made that person do something against their own interest. We think it is exactly the same in its moral wrongness. But last, they're just like, they kind of cancel out. It drowns out the Republican conspiracy theories. That would have been nice if they actually tried to prove this claim. There's two very obvious reasons why it isn't doing that, and that is because they're targeting totally different audiences. One are a set of stupid Republicans that will believe the Republican conspiracy theories. One is a set of stupid Democrats who will believe the Democrat conspiracy theories. So we should keep the nice, innocent, stupid Democrats without believing conspiracy theories under our side. But second, is even if it's true somehow that this was the same person that is now getting conflicting conspiracy theories, we think encouraging a Republican response is a problem. And the Republicans are always going to do more of this. They're always going to be more willing to push past red lines, go further in the ways that they try and do electoral manipulation. Stooping to their level does not work, and we cannot ever match them sufficiently. This was just a stupid idea. We think we should stick to our morals, ultimately, because even if you believe literally everything in their case, it is so improbable that this is the one specific tool, rather than just telling the truth, that is ultimately going to sway the election. Like, the literal best case is you sway a small handful of votes, that is a tiny percentage chance of swaying the election. But you care much more about principles in this debate for two reasons. One is, we know for certain that this is wrong. Like, it is potentially morally grey, potentially not as wrong as holding a gun to someone's head, but it is still certainly manipulation. It is still certainly something that is irrational. It is still certainly something that we morally should reprehensibly say is wrong. But second, it is that we're preying on some of the most vulnerable individuals. Some of the easiest people to suggest in society, some of the individuals that buy into conspiracy theories because of significant state disenfranchisement. To manipulate those people, we think is especially morally wrong, particularly given that the Democrats have campaigned on a narrative of the Republicans doing all this gerrymandering and anti-democratic things. This is something the Democrats should never stand by. We support never allowing this policy to happen in the first place.
Well, in that second negative speech, Eugene tells you that all Republican voters are very stupid. He tells you that all Republican politicians are pedophiles. And he tells you that all Republican politicians want to ban abortion. None of these claims are true, and yet he seemed to think that they would be very plausible to this audience. And that is exactly the contention of side affirmative in this debate, that there are a bunch of things that are actually not true about Republicans, but that many people are receptive to because it sounds like things that could be true about Republicans. For example, it is not true that every Republican is pro the Second Amendment, but it's very easy to make the claim that that is true, and it's something that the average voter would obviously believe. It is not true that every Republican does not support abortion rights. Many of them don't, but it is so easy now for us to tar the moderates who happen to have positions that are more popular on abortion with the less popular positions of everyone else. That was a contention of side affirmative, that we would continue to do what the Democratic Party and every political party in the world has always done, which is to lie and manipulate their voters because it's what is effective and it is what works time and time again. So, the first thing I'm going to do in this speech is just determine if there is an imperative, because this is perhaps their cleverest way of winning the debate. Then I'll explain why this is extremely effective, and finally respond to their principle. So, is there an imperative in this debate? They suggest, well, the Democrats are just going to win the election so clearly in 2024 that we don't need to worry about what tactics we use at all. Well, one, that also seems to suggest that there's no real harm to doing this either. Our margin of victory is so clear. But we would suggest that this is an unintuitive claim for 4 reasons. First reason is just that the last 2 elections have been quite close, and since there's a similar set of candidates running in these elections, you'd expect it to once again be close. Secondly, thermostatic effects mean that generally the person who is in power tends to have a bit of a backlash against them at the next election, particularly at the point in time when economic performance has been quite poor during their term, and note the rampant inflation that has occurred during Biden's term. Thirdly, we would suggest that Biden has empirically relatively low approval ratings compared to other presidents at this point in their term. And fourthly, the US is just generally a pretty conservative country, and things like gerrymandering and the structure of the Electoral College mean that there's a huge bias towards Republicans being able to win without even winning the overall national popular vote. All would suggest what the average reasonable person already knew, which is that it's probably unlikely the Democrats have a 50-point lead going into the next election. That was a bit silly. But secondly, they suggest, well, maybe it wouldn't be that bad if Trump won. Actually, I don't think they even suggest this, but just to prove this anyway, I think the average reasonable person, again, understands why this threat is quite important. We explained to you that Trump represents a pretty substantial threat to democracy itself, because he's openly called for things like a dictatorship. He's openly suggested he does not care about the Constitution. He's openly suggested that checks and balances are not important. But secondly, because the stakes are incredibly high, he would be able to do things like appoint further Supreme Court justices and tip the balance of the Supreme Court further to the right. Because, for example, he already appointed more federal judges than any previous president in US history. If he had the capacity to do so again, that means that all of the various circuit courts of the US would now impose decisions that are far more right-wing. Think about the effect of overturning Roe v. Wade and what that did at the federal level. Imagine that multiplying itself hundreds of times over a variety of different decisions. But it also looks things like being able to appoint various people to executives, gut various federal departments, and do things like prevent action on climate change. So, with that very clear, let's explain all the ways why our policy would obviously be very effective at helping the Democrats win elections. Establishing the imperative here is obviously so important that it means that principle doesn't really matter, but I'll address it later. We explained to you the easiest reason to believe this is effective, which is just to say it already happens and it already works. Do they give you any responses to believe that it doesn't occur in the status quo? Not really, they just insist Democrats are the party of the smart man and they only tell the truth, and Republicans are the dumb poo-poo party. Well, like one, that seems like they've already kind of bought into the Kool-Aid there. The average person doesn't actually believe that. But here are a set of reasons why it in fact makes sense that these things already occur in the status quo. Firstly, we point out it's just in the inherent interest of politicians to lie. One, because when you lie, you convince people who otherwise would not vote for you on the merits to vote for you. And two, because it's very hard to call out those lies. For the reason that things like fact-checking, one, take time, two, require people who are politically engaged, the vast majority of whom are not, and three, are just very boring. Like, no one actually goes and checks them unless you're a politics hack like the people in this room. The average person is not one of those people. But secondly, just because the affirmative bench points to so many empirical examples of the Democratic Party doing this down the bench, that you ought to believe that it occurs to at least some extent. For example, we talked to you explicitly about how Biden has repeatedly lied about always being pro-gay marriage, how he's repeatedly lied about never supporting fracking in the past, when he did for ages support fracking. We talked about how he's accused Trump of running up a budget deficit, knowing that the reason that spending occurred was that Congress passed very large stimulus spending in the wake of COVID, all of which was incredibly dishonest. So, if you believe that it is already the tactic of the Democratic Party to do this, side affirmative clearly wins this debate. Because one, it demonstrates that clearly a very politically motivated actor in the debate believes this is an effective tactic and therefore chooses to engage in it, which means you should also believe it is an effective tactic, particularly because the Democratic Party obviously has very strong incentives to want to win and would re-evaluate if it didn't seem to be working. But secondly, it also explains the Democratic Party has the experience to do it well and obviously hasn't seen the backlash that this team suggests would arise. So if you believe that, and you should, we already win the debate. But let's explain why in that best case, where you believe this would be a new set of tactics that we're deploying for the first time, this would still be incredibly effective. Let's go through each of the things we suggest in turn and explain why it would work. First thing we suggest is we would fund extreme Republican candidates in the primaries, therefore making for an easier win in the general election. Why is this likely to work? Firstly, empirically just worked in the 2022 election. We got a large number of insane candidates to run in the general, and then we're able to knock them out. Herschel Walker Jr., Doug Mastriano, or Dr. Oz, like famously bad candidates, all of which got in because Democratic super PACs donated millions of dollars to their campaigns in the Republican primaries. That seems like something that would obviously be very easy to do. Their only response to this is to say, well, Trump will just make sure they win the primary anyway. Like, in some cases, Trump's endorsement might be enough to tip it over the edge. We can ensure that in places where that is insufficient, we could make sure those candidates win when they otherwise wouldn't. Obviously, there are always marginal electorates. There are always more candidates that we could help win in this way. Secondly, we say we could just lie about Republican positions. I already explained why this is so easy, because Eugene does all the legwork for me here. We could accuse Republicans who are more moderate of wanting to cut Medicare and Social Security. Sounds incredibly credible. We could accuse them of being in favor of abortion. We could accuse various Republicans of wanting to suppress the turnout of voters because of the way that they happen to position certain ballot boxes within their jurisdictions. Incredibly hard to respond to why that is not your intention. Incredibly easy to make that kind of pejorative claim. Similarly, we explain that we can lie about our positions quite easily. For example, during times of high inflation like now, it might be a good time to de-emphasize climate change in the agenda and pretend we don't care about it as much as we do, and pretend that we care more about things like expanding US energy drilling, for example, with the Willow Creek project, than we might otherwise do in the long run. That would be an easy way to get voters on board. They have one response to this, which is just to say you'll get called out by the media. We explain that right-wing media will lie about you anyway, so it doesn't matter. That left-wing and centrist media are unlikely to do so. One, because it's incredibly boring, uninteresting content that no one wants to watch, especially people who are not politically engaged. Secondly, because left-wing people are obviously on your side and wouldn't do it. They say left-wing people really care about the truth. No, they don't. Stop drinking the Kool-Aid, guys. You don't care about the truth. You care about winning. AOC, literally, off-the-charts PolitiFact lie meter. No one cares about this at all. Lastly, let's respond to the principle. They say it's wrong to mislead people. We say, one, everyone already does it, so you bite the harm anyway. Two, the burden is on this team to be very honest then, far more honest than the Democrats are in the status quo. They don't defend it. Thirdly, we explain that it just counters right-wing propaganda. And fourthly, they never explain why it's against people's interest to vote for the Democrats. Please do that at third negative, I guess. The end of this debate, you all believe our set of tactics already occur, even if they don't, they would be effective. And even if that's not true, the burden on this team is not just to, it's to actually actively roll back a set of very obvious things that Democrats already do, to not accept donations from these super PACs, and to be far, far less effective.
Ben gives you at the top of their speech a series of reasons to believe the Republican Party is so morally bankrupt and so horrend in the way that it treats the American people, we ought not let anything happen that might advantage them. In Connor's speech, he then tells you that we have an infinite moral license to do whatever we want to stop this from happening. I think if any of those reasons were compelling to you, they're also going to be compelling to the average American voter. And at the end of this debate, it's super unclear why we actually need to lie in the first place. At the end of that, you ought to consider two things most important. The first is the risk that this causes backlash, because that doesn't just compromise this election, it compromises every Democrat who's involved in those lies in their midterms. It compromises every future presidential election that the Democratic Party engages in. But the second thing you ought to weigh highly is the principled harm of this debate. Because it's not just about the principled harm of this election, it's about the collateral damage that this causes. Because they suggest things like lumping in and telling lies about moderate Republicans. That is an affront to that Republicans' rights to run a fair election and to be elected if their constituents support them, and to every single constituent who wants to elect that Republican Party. If in future moderate Republicans don't get elected because of their case, it is an affront to the democratic rights of all the people who now have to live under the authority of a Democrat who they do not want in power. I think that principled harm wins us the debate outright. Three things. Firstly, is lying actually necessary? Secondly, is lying effective or counterproductive? And thirdly, Thirdly, is all of this worth robbing people of their democratic rights? Firstly, is lying necessary? The first thing we prove to you is that these lies add nothing, because the Republican Party does enough insane things that you can tell the truth and still get people outraged. For example, people like Matt Gaetz are literal sex pedophiles who do things like sex trafficking, and half the other Republicans are or have been accused of rape. That is not a lie. Sure, it's untrue that all Republicans are rapists, but there are enough rapist Republicans that you can make effective arguments to explain why there is a culture of misogyny in the Republican Party. Secondly, they did things like actively try to steal an election by making fraudulent claims about voter fraud. Thirdly, they did things like gerrymander literally a quarter of the country out of having voting rights. Fourthly, they do stuff like some of them believe in truly insane conspiracy theories, like Jewish space lasers. And fourthly, because for all the reasons that Ben explains, every time a Republican Party has gone in government, they have failed their country. They have enacted policies that caused immense amounts of harm. They have gutted agencies. They have made partisan appointments. They have caused affronts to democracy. All of those reasons are compelling enough on their own, even without lying. And I'd note that you don't actually need to lump in Trump as one of these insane people, because he is himself, by admission, one of these right-wing MAGA nutheads. He literally made the acronym and started that brand himself. He's the reason why all of these people are so insane. You don't need to tell lies about Trump to rally people against him. We did it once effectively, we can do it again. Secondly, then why would the Democratic Party already win anyway? There's a series of reasons we give you to believe that the Democratic Party is likely to win on both sides, making the actual motivation or imperative for telling all these lies completely pointless. The first is the polling. Biden is clearly ahead of Trump. He's indicated to win. Secondly, because of incumbency bias, Udai gives you a fake mechanism to believe the opposite is true, but if you look at the statistics of how many times people have lost re-election, it's actually exceedingly rare in the history of American democracy, which establishes to you that actually there is a strong incentive to re-elect presidents after they've already served their first term. Thirdly, it's because people really dislike Trump, especially in the wake. Now, there are active federal proceedings against him, and he might actually end up in prison or at least having some form of conviction. Fourthly, it's because the Republican Party continues to enact conservative policy that the average voter does not support, things like overturning Roe v. Wade. Or fifthly, because of the incredible things that Joe Biden has done, which Democrats can point to during his terms. That's stuff like extensive climate infrastructure. That's things like fixing Trump's fiscal mismanagement through the Inflation Reduction Act. That's things like the Build Back Better program, which have created more jobs than any American president in the last half century. There's absolutely no reason to lie about Biden's policies. He just genuinely has done a good job, and pointing to that empirical fact is what will bring the Democratic Party to success. What does Udai say? Firstly, he says it was close last time. Firstly, I don't know that it necessarily was, but secondly, I think the better litmus test was the midterms, which were a complete Republican blowout compared to how they were expected to do, which demonstrates to you that actually the American people, as it stands at present, are anti the Republican Party for all the reasons that Ben, Connor, and Udai described to you throughout all of their speeches. Second thing that he says is the American country is extremely conservative, but I would note that support for progressive policies is at an all-time high in America. Things like supporting the Green New Deal is like 70%, and those kinds of statistics prove to you that America is actually a country with the capacity to support a Democratic candidate who I would note is pretty moderate, has enacted good policies, and is running against someone who is truly insane. At the end of that class, you should believe, firstly, that we don't need to tell lies to rally people and motivate people, but secondly, that the Republican Party is going to lose, and there's no point risking the lies in order to make them lose. Second question in this debate, is lying effective or counterproductive? Their entire case here is just that it gets people super rallied up against the Republican Party. I would note, firstly, the kinds of conspiracies they talk about often just actively overwhelm voters. Honesty is what wins elections, because honesty makes people actually passionate about their candidate. If you tell lies that make everyone seem like a freak, and you have both the Republican Party seeming insane because of the lies the Democratic Party tells, and also the Democratic Party seeming insane because of lies told by the Republicans, people just don't turn out to vote in the first place, rather than voting for the candidate that this team would prefer that they did. But secondly, I would note this comes at the expense of just telling the truth. And what that means for this debate is when you actually get a Democratic candidate elected to the presidency, their capacity to elect meaningful reform is much lower, because the things that the American public believes that Joe Biden in his second term should do are different to the actual things that he should do. He's less capable of fixing the Republican Party, preventing them from doing terrible things, because the American voters are misled in terms of what it is they believe the Republican Party's issues are. But secondly, we explained a series of reasons why this is extremely counterproductive, and that's because it risks causing huge amounts of backlash. The first part of this, which they don't just respond to at all, is the fact that this is literally illegal, which means if you get caught out for doing this, those super PACs that engaged in voter fraud now can't advertise in the areas and the jurisdictions which they were caught out for lying in. And we know that's extremely likely for the mechanisms that Ben provides you, because courts have been stacked with judges who are in favour of the Republican Party, which means you're actually quite likely to get this kind of illegality getting called out. But the second reason we give you is just that people find out about this and then turn against your party or become politically apathetic. Their response to this is that we already do it all the time and people don't care. But I would note the Democratic Party just does have a huge problem right now with preventing people from becoming apathetic. There is a large portion of the American population that believes that both parties live in ivory towers and don't serve their interests. It is absolutely untrue that this tried and true method of lying works successfully. The main criticism of the Democratic Party is that they are terrible and lie and just as bad as the Republican Party, and that's one of their biggest threats. But secondly, I think their claim that the super PACs having a revealed preference to lie, and therefore it must be a good thing because they have experts, just doesn't work for the same reasons that they described. That the super PACs have many other incentives and their own incentives. They act independently. I don't think the fact that they consistently lie means necessarily lying is a good thing. Third and final thing in the speech then, is this all worth robbing people of their democratic rights? Their first claim here is that people are already exposed to lots of misinformation and super PACs lie anyway, so that's totally fine. But I would note, firstly, we explain why the number of people who are deceived actually goes up. And the reason for that is twofold. It's firstly, because these lies hit different people. You're not actively misleading one person one way and then back the other way. It's different people in different areas getting misled by all of this misinformation, which means you're now actually just increasing the number of people who are misled. But I would note that that doesn't make it acceptable. For example, it wouldn't be morally acceptable for me to kill one member of the affirmative team if I also promised to also kill one member of the negative team. I've just committed two moral wrongs in that instance. We ought not support that kind of principled immorality. But secondly, because we explained to you that it makes Republicans escalate the amount of misinformation they are engaging in, which means the total amount of people who are misled goes up. Their only good response to this is to say that it's not the state doing this. But that obviously doesn't matter, because what we're saying is people deserve to have informed consent when they pick who they vote for. And that is the most important thing in this debate, to deny people that right. And that doesn't just have ramifications on this election. I explained to you previously why it has ramifications on all future elections, because the Republican moderates who are harmed by their lies, in the end, lose their democratic rights and so do their constituents. And because in the long term, this diminishes our trust in democracy, which I think is also a principal harm. For these reasons, very proud of the game.
To lie to a voter because their vote is the bridge between them and their best outcomes. Every individual's experience is different. That's why every individual gets their own vote. Lying pollutes that choice, and that is wrong. We agree that there is some lying that occurs under our side, but that lying is kept to a minimum through rebuttal mechanisms such as media, fact checkers, and legal checks. Adding to that problem is not okay. They say, just because there is wrong that is happening today, it's totally fine if we add more wrong. There's no tipping point. They use debatory jargon and tactics that are absolutely immoral. It is wrong to lie to someone and rob them of the capacity of knowing which politician to vote for and which outcome to select. The problem with the affirmative team is that their case is morally incomplete. They need to justify that lying, they need to prove that lying is justified, and they only do that by arguing that the Republicans winning would be so deeply immoral. But why? They never prove that that's the case. They say that they are partisan appointments, but Democrats also partisanly appoint. They say that they remove checks and balances, but you would need to believe that expeditious law is somehow a moral wrong for people to vote for. They say Republicans gut environmental agencies, as if it is wrong to want a mining job for your family. They never prove that the Republicans being voted into power is so immensely immoral. Ultimately, many people vote for Republicans because that is their choice, that is their self-actualization. The ordinary intelligent voter, not you, the ordinary intelligent voter thinks sometimes that voting for the Republicans is a moral choice. That is to say, we do not lose this debate if the Democrats lose the next election. That is our first path to victory. And even if they win on theirs, we still think we win. And the reason is because we far prioritize everyone being able to actually vote in the way that is meaningful for them. The class of people who are not lied to shrinks so significantly. And the class of people who are not lied to are larger than the set of people that would matter in this debate who would want to be, voting Democrat. They don't explain that people in general in society matter less than the set of people that they want to benefit, which is like some Democratic judges who will miss out on an appointment. But even if you believe that the Democratic Party's success is so important, Affirmative's path to victory here is so shallowly explained. To achieve it, they have to go through this long, bumpy, and unlikely path to victory. Their case has so many contingencies to prove in order to prove a successful election of a Democratic Democratic president that is different to us. They must prove that we will not get it, then they must also prove that they get the Democrat election. They have 6 contingencies. The first is that they need to prove that the Democrats are in trouble, but we explained the red wave demonstrates a failure of Republicans to actually mobilize their bases, and the Green New Deal and the increase of youth voters that come into the next election is a changing set of voters, which therefore means that we don't think the Democrats are in trouble. Secondly, they need to prove that there is a dearth and a lack of examples that are similar to that which the affirmative makes up. They suggest that Biden needs to have a lie made up about him, that he cares about racial justice. Why? They suggest that we need to make up lies about Republicans being okay with and also covering up like child pornography scandals. Why? We don't need to make that up. That contingency was not proven. Thirdly, they need to prove that super PACs are consistent in crafting a cohesive lie, because it is not clear that one super PAC says the same thing as another super PAC, such that your lie is successful. One super PAC can say Biden is pro-queer people because it's a progressive super PAC, but one is more centrist and says Biden is not that queer. You should vote for him if you're like a moderate, right? So it's not clear that they actually prove that they're consistent. Fourthly, they need to prove that lies are continued by politicians and the politicians believe them and don't rebut them. Fifthly, they need to prove that the lies are believed by Republicans and swing voters such that they change their votes for some reason. Sixthly, they need to prove that Democrats are okay with this and don't maybe shift their votes, or that swing voters would otherwise have voted for the Democratic Party believe that the Democrats have done an immoral wrong that is an affront to their democracy. Ultimately, people vote for the Democrats because they protect the institution of democracy. They protect the institution of freedom and liberality, but the opposition necessarily nukes that. That is the death of not just democracy, but also their so-called important stakeholder of the Democrats. Some people vote Republican. That's totally fair.
Negative makes a series of claims that make a lot of sense in the most uncontentious and therefore the least important races. They make a series of claims as to why, well, if your Republican candidate is literally already a pedophile, you don't need to lie about them being a pedophile. But the problem for this team is that those races weren't ones that we cared about. They weren't ones that were contentious. Our mechanisms come into play when you're dealing with a race between two moderates, and where it is advantageous for you to be able to say that a Republican who in fact actually does think abortion rights are good, to tar that person with the brush of saying that no they don't, they support a federal abortion ban. Our claims come into play when you're able to do things like use manipulation of PAC-raised funds to get your Herschel Walkers into these positions in order to make them easy for moderate Democrats to defeat. And those are the races that genuinely mattered when it came to making sure that the Democrats were able to win. This team does a lot to explain why they win in contexts where Democrats are already trusted, where people already believe in the truth, where people already believe in what the Democratic Party is saying. Awesome. Doesn't get them anywhere near close enough to win the debate because they don't deal with the situations that actually matter. So, why is it that winning is particularly important, and why is it that this is a question that is genuinely in doubt in this debate? This team, I think, really relies on assertions to suggest that the Democrats are going to win. They assert at negative reply that demographics are changing, that young people vote. I don't know, they don't actually explain that that's true. They don't actually explain that young people are overwhelmingly Democrat. But also, we give you a series of better claims in Udai's speech that they do not really respond to because they are obviously just true claims. We explained that obviously, the Democrats we know lost in 2016 to Trump. We explained that the last election and the election before that were real nail-biters. You shouldn't believe that things have shifted so drastically that in 2024 it's going to be a blowout for the Dems. We explained that winning is also very necessary. We give you 4 key claims here. The first and most important one is that if you think that this is a debate about maximizing democratic outcomes and enfranchisement and truth and honor in the system, you should be very concerned about the Republicans winning, because when the Republicans win, they will do far more damage to that system than our lies and manipulation do. We tell you that they will do things like disenfranchise people. We tell you that Trump has made claims about wanting to establish a dictatorship. We tell you that this is a party that wants to do things like disenfranchise people, institute voter identification laws, and reduce people's access to the franchise, and that it will do things like gut the civil service and pack out courts. All of that is far worse for democratic systems, far worse for civil rights, than introducing lies and manipulation that largely already occur, that are largely already legal, and part of the American system already would do. And we give you 3 other reasons. We explain that this is important for foreign aid outcomes for people who are disadvantaged all around the world, that it's important for protecting Ukrainians and continuing to fight for them, and that it's important for dealing with the climate crisis as well. And that means that I think that at the end of this, even if you thought that access to the franchise in the US was particularly important, you should also care about other people around the world who are affected by American foreign policy, and you should probably care about them far more than you care about these Americans who are maybe subject to our misinformation and maybe have their access to truth somewhat mitigated or something like that in this debate. Which means then that I think that when it comes to things like your human rights, like your access to the franchise, your ability to live the good life, that we are winning pretty conclusively on that clash because of the fact that we are better able to get the Democrats into power. So, last issue then. Why is it that these tactics are necessary to win? First thing to say here is that there are many narrow races, we explained to you, where this is particularly important, where you're dealing with a moderate who isn't actually a pedophile or who does not actually represent the worst of the Republican Party. And in these contexts, our lies and our manipulation are quite valuable. One, they depress turnout amongst moderates because you convince them that this person is crazy and does not represent them, even if that's not necessarily true. Two, they do things like depress turnout amongst people who are susceptible to conspiracy theories because we're able to suggest that both sides are the same, both sides are in bed with each other, both sides are elites who want to do things that make those people particularly upset. Which is why it is particularly easy then to depress the turnout of people who overwhelmingly vote Republican. But when it comes to Democrats and other people who are left in these races, they just have nowhere else to go. Team says they'll be mad. I'm sure they will be mad, maybe. But I mean, who else are they going to vote for? It's a two-party system, it's unclear and unlikely that they would go anywhere else. And it seems like if you're a Democrat supporter, this might make you rather sad, but you still likely recognize the necessity of it, given the mechanisms we give you. So, because we secured more equity for people outside and within the US, and because we gave you a better chance of avoiding the worst excesses of Republican policy, proud to affirm.